Okay, so I was just joking when I got in here that this was certainly not like on purpose, but Andy's talk this morning really is going to segue nicely. And in fact, he joked about a few cliches in his slides. Watch for the same cliches here too. So I assume that if you're in this room, you are actually interested in learning about complexity science. And if that's not the case, you have my permission to leave now. And I think with the title of the talk, I always kind of start this just by trying to assess, like, how many people in here have heard or used the phrase trying to tame complexity, or maybe you put it on your resume or your LinkedIn that you're really good at simplifying complexity, taking complex problems and making them easy to deal with and such. I'm not going to make you raise your hands, but my whole talk here is premised on the idea that there are certain types of systems and domains that you cannot simplify, you cannot tame. And if that makes you uncomfortable, again, you have permission to leave. But ultimately, everything here, spoiler, you can't tame it. So this is much more about how we embrace it, navigate it, and actually facilitate good things within complexity. Okay, now is the point where I will actually say, raise your hand if you've ever embarked on a project, navigated a partnership, blueprinted a service, or designed any kind of experience that unfolded a little like this. You've done your research, you've agreed on where you want to go, you've built the roadmap to get there, to head in that direction. You've even started off in those first few steps towards your goals. You're moving confidently as a team, and then something like this. If you are from the States or have seen the American version of The Office, maybe you remember this episode. If not, what's happening here is that one of the characters is driving, following GPS directions. It tells him to turn right, and right is into a lake. Meanwhile, passenger, navigator, is arguing, no, I don't think it meant that. I think we actually needed it to be up there, the road's up there, the GPS is wrong. And the driver is saying, no, I'm following the roadmap, right? So I love this because it can raise a lot of good questions, like who's at fault for them ending up in the lake? Is it the GPS itself? Is it the designer of the GPS? Is it the driver who is sticking to the roadmap no matter what? Is it the navigator who didn't fight hard enough or grab the wheel to change course? Is it just the unpredictability of the terrain? You know, and this is where I say something like, we're probably going to see more of this as the world grows increasingly uncertain. And then when I use that phrase, I think how that phrase, which you've probably heard a few times today, and I've actually started previous talks with, in a world that's growing more uncertain. Like, it sounds like a movie trailer. In a world that's growing more volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. Yeah, I don't even know if I like this phrase. I'm kind of sick of it. Are you guys sick of it? And I'll also say, I'm not convinced the world is actually any more complex or ambiguous than it ever has been. I think we are more aware. I think we're more connected and the information flows more freely, so we're hyper aware of what's always been the case. This has been the case for as long as humans have been around. And I like this quote because it's really just kind of showing you, hey, this is something that we have faced for probably as long as humans have been able to communicate with each other. It's by a guy that is actually, he was a Prussian war official, I think. I don't like the war metaphor, but I like to show you, look how long ago he said this, right? This is really the sentiment. This is it. I mean, this is what we're all dealing with. And this is a wicked problem. It's an intractable problem that we as designers face, right? So as designers, we're trained to ask why. Why is that the case? Why does anything we really try to do face the possibility of kind of becoming useless as soon as I take a few steps forward? Because not only might the terrain change, my own goals might change, right? So this talk is going to answer a little bit of why, but I also want to admit something to you guys right now. This talk is a prototype. Everything I do is a prototype, probably the same for you. And I find that complexity science, which hopefully probably was the phrase that attracted you, is having a moment right now. It's sort of an extension of systems thinking, which I think we've all probably embraced largely as a field more than others. But the problem with complexity science, it is very esoteric, it's very abstract, and it's almost kind of like impossible to get into it at a 101 level. So what you find are people who share things about complexity science are usually either sharing things at such a high level, they're just platitudes, and they're kind of not really useful for actual practice, or they get so into the weeds that we lose people right away because you either have to come at an angle of physics or philosophy or biology or some other kind of window that may not be accessible to everyone. So my goal is that I'm trying to get in between those two extremes, but I may not do a good job. So I'll be curious after the fact. Is this too high level and is it useless, or is it too much in the weeds and I lose you in 10 minutes? We'll find out together. But ultimately, what is complexity, right? Why, when I say, right, we're going to be facing increasing uncertainty and we're going to find our roadmap becomes useless as soon as we hit reality, why does that happen? Here's why. The types of systems that we are concerned with as service designers tend to be human systems. And human systems are naturally dynamic, and because humans, at least ideally, have autonomy, have agency, are highly interconnected, and the decisions and behaviors that they do are interdependent, all of that interdependence and interconnectivity and all that freedom of choice and movement means that even if we could model every possible thing that could ever happen in that human system, if the computers could do that, which some of them are getting close to being able to do that, they still won't be actually able to tell us with any kind of certainty because the variability is so high. And so if you sort of fall asleep over the next 3 or 4 slides, this is really the sentiment, all right? Complexity science is really a way of understanding things because it's like this. And I'll point out, Murray Gell-Mann was a physicist. I'll also let you in on a little secret. My background was physics before I went into service design, but you don't need a physics background to understand any of this, okay? That's my whole point of my talk, is giving you guys the shortcut without the physics degree. But Murray Gell-Mann also did something else. He was highly interdisciplinary. He was like a lot of us. He was a generalist. He wanted not just inter or transdisciplinary. He wanted post-disciplinary work and collaboration to happen. He was very interested in this topic. He co-founded the Santa Fe Institute, which is one of the organizations today that does a lot of really cool work in complexity and complexity science. So I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But what the heck is it? Like, what are we going to actually talk about today? I promise there won't be a quiz later, but unlike a lot of intro talks I see, I do actually want to teach you something. I'll just try to keep it brief. So complexity science is the study of organisms, networks, ecologies of interconnected components whose interactions give rise to unpredictable, there's that word again, self-organizing and emergent outcomes. Oh no, did we lose it there? Why do we care? Because studying the behavior of complex adaptive systems, especially complex human systems, helps us create the conditions for desirable things to emerge. That's our whole goal as service designers, right? Even when cause and effect are not linear or understandable, which is, of course, the big challenge with a complex system, okay? So understanding how they behave help us design within it. Now, a couple things I want to do as we talk about complexity. First, I want to contrast what a complex system is compared to other types of systems. And then I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what the key properties of it are. This sounds so technical, I promise it won't be. Then we're actually going to get into like, what the hell do you do about it? Okay, so we'll get there. But ultimately, I want you to remember one big thing from this slide. The word complex, we use it in very colloquial terms, right? You know, oh, this is a very complex problem, or oh my God, this is really getting complex. We also use words like complicated or messy, and we tend to use these words interchangeably. What's really important is that complex systems are actually a very distinct field of study, and the word complex, when we use it in this way, especially complex adaptive systems, are fundamentally a different type of system than what we might call complicated or other labels we won't get into today. So my point is, we have to be very careful about our language because a complex system and a complicated system are not interchangeable. They are different. And so in order to explain that, I actually really like a framework from, and by the way, we're not going to get into big frameworks here because frankly, they're tools in the toolbox and use any framework you want. But one I like is from a company called the Cynefin Company. Dave Snowden has developed this. It's called the Cynefin framework. And again, I'm just going to give you a fast version of it because the key is to contrast complexity with other things. So there are 4 types of system that are in this framework. Notice on the right, it says ordered. I'm not sure if you can see it, a little small. Ordered systems are predictable, right? So in the first example of an ordered system, these are clear, very easy to understand systems, right? So meaning you can get in, you can take a look at it, you can figure out what you have, and you know what to do. This is literally like baking a cake. Like baking a cake or following a recipe is a clear, simple, ordered system. As long as you are following the directions, using the right ingredients, you will get the same thing every time, right? That is like the best kind of scenario. And I know there are some of you who probably went into design hoping/expecting design to be like this, but God help you if you're still in this field, man. You might just want to get on out. The next kind of ordered system is similar, except it's got a little more stuff going on. It's still ordered, okay? So we use the term complicated to mean systems that are still ordered and predictable. You still have cause and effect, but it might take a little bit of expertise to see it. You might need the analysis and lived experience of folks, whether experts or otherwise, who can actually identify that cause and effect. It's a little harder to see, but it is there. Cause and effect is there, happening linearly. And so in this case, it's still an ordered system, but it just needs expertise to be able to navigate and design for. And so an example of this might be designing a rocket, launching something into space. It's obviously harder. It is more complicated than baking a cake, but it's totally doable. It's predictable. The laws of physics aren't changing every day. And so doing this with the right experts in the room is relatively straightforward. This is the realm of things like service blueprints as a metaphor, but we'll come back to that. Here is where, of course, we are most interested today. I've now moved to the left side, and that is where we get into systems that are not ordered. They are not predictable because cause and effect are no longer simply linear. It's not a simple relationship between when this thing happens and that thing happens, because when this thing happens, enough other things are happening that the next thing happens, make it impossible to draw backwards to the root cause. If that makes you uncomfortable, good. Don't let go of that feeling. Don't ignore it. That's what we're basically going to be designing in and for the rest of our lives, basically. Complex systems, as you can see here, you see the practices that I listed there, like clear systems, there are best practices and we just follow them, and that's great. And in a complicated system, there's not so much a best practice because you can have different expertise that feel differently, but you have good practices. In a complex system, there ain't no best practice. Best practice is past practice. It worked yesterday. There's no guarantee it's going to work today. So what you have are emergent practices that you have to figure out as you go. It's much more about sensing and responding in the moment than having a plan and sticking to it, or doing what somebody else did yesterday, or doing what you did somewhere else. Those contexts are no longer the same. Context is huge in complexity, okay? And this is like anything that you've ever done with people. So if you've raised children or are raising children, if you take care of pets, if you have to drive in traffic with other people, navigating family and friendship relationships. I like to use this as an example, especially because here's the thing. Every single person in this room, you all already know about complexity. You manage it and navigate it every day of your life. It's part of being human. All we've done as like a society is try to kind of put up a wall so that when we get to the workplace, we just pretend it doesn't exist and we pretend that the workplace is just complicated or even better, clear. And I know, Andy's talking about optimizing processes and the machine metaphor, exactly. So I really like to think about what I do as not teaching anything new because you guys already know about complexity. Yeah. All we're trying to do is kind of unkink the hose and let you reconnect what you already know to the work that you do, okay? The fourth kind here I won't spend much time on, but is chaotic. And if you're a math nerd, this is not actually using the word chaos in the way that mathematicians do, but it's just to say that some systems are volatile, things are on fire, and all you can do in that case is like act quickly. Don't worry about what is supposed to happen. Just take care of the thing that needs to get taken care of. I'll also say briefly, these four categories of system, they're not static. So an environment, a domain, a situation you find yourself in can actually shift. But what people hear when they hear that is they go, oh, you mean if I'm in a complex system, if I do something, I can just make it complicated or make it clear? No, it's not quite that simple. Systems will shift in form, but not usually because of anything we might do directly. I'll leave it at that. That's a more complicated conversation, but if you're interested, the Cynefin framework gets into a lot of that. All we care about today is this. We're really going to talk about complexity, and I just wanted you guys to know what the word complex actually means in contrast with some of these common words. And I know I'm moving through these kind of fast. I know I'm not, moving through much of the content too fast, but I see all the phones. I'll make these slides available too. And I have a QR code I'll put up at the end with some links to things. So don't feel too stressed if taking photos makes it harder for you guys to concentrate. Okay, yeah. So we're gonna get into complexity a little bit more here. And I want, like I said earlier, to go deeper than usually just the platitudes that people share. There's a whole world around complexity science. It's a real thing. It's not just like somebody made up the phrase like design thinking. No, just kidding. It's an actual field of study that is both social and people talk about soft science and hard science. That's all bullshit. But it's science in the way that we actually study it in a rigorous way. It's relatively nascent though. I mean, the field as a kind of concept has really only been around since like the middle of last century and really started to come into its own in the 80s. I'm not getting into any of this. There's a reason that's not legible, but that map is interactive, and I have a link to it, in some stuff I'll share. So if you want to dive in, go for it. I'm also not going to read you a Wikipedia article on this, but what I am going to do is focus on a couple key properties of complex systems that make them unique. Like, why do we care if something is complex versus merely complicated, for service design in particular, okay? So, and again, I know some of you love this stuff and some of you are like, oh my God, stop. So just bear with me because I think these are really important, and I challenge you to be thinking about each of these and how they relate to your practice as a service designer. So the first is path dependence, right? And this is a phrase that just means past decisions and events influence the current situation and direction that a system is going, and they can make it really hard to change course. We're not bound to repeat history. Like, I'm not saying that we're always stuck on a rail and we can't change, but what I'm saying is that we can't erase the past or the choices that we made to get us to where we are today, and trying to pretend that they don't exist or trying to engage in some kind of change or transformation as a blank slate, like, how many times has that worked? Has anyone ever actually seen that work? Raise your hand if you've ever seen a change effort happen because somebody said, forget about the past, it's gone. No, seriously, now you're afraid to raise your hand, I know. Rhetorical question. But point is, path dependence is a trait of complex systems that we have to honor and acknowledge, and we work around it, and we move forward in a way that we know the history can't be ignored. Another trait is called nonlinearity, and you've heard me talk about linear stuff before. I think most people know the word linear just colloquially, but what it really means is if things are not linear, effects don't always match the size of their causes, right? So a small force on a system or a small action that a human could take, right, could cause like a disproportionately large effect, or vice versa. You could put a lot of energy into doing something that has almost no effect, and it's not really easy to tell which is going to be which, right? This is where, and I hate to do this because this is no shade on anybody who gave talks on any of this in the last day, but root causes, linear theories of change, logic models, causal loops, these are seductive and we love them, because they give us some confidence that we're following something that's got some evidence, and that if it all goes to shit, it's not our fault. Those things that I just said, there's nothing wrong with them. They're actually very effective in ordered systems. So if you're working in a domain where things are very well established, they are on the rails, and there are places where we work that I would consider complicated, not complex, certain regulatory environments, certain very bounded situations, absolutely. Or if you're focused on something relatively narrow, and I don't mean that in a bad way, yes, root causes, causal loops, logic models can be effective. But when you are working with a complex system, those things actually kind of become a hindrance, because we start to rely on them and we know what's going to happen is they're going to be wrong tomorrow. So I'm not saying throw them out, but I'm saying be aware that the non-linear behavior of a complex system makes those kind of attractive frameworks and tools dangerous, because we focus on those instead of what we could actually be doing effectively. Those two properties I just mentioned are the kind of thing that lead to what physicists and mathematicians call chaos and chaos theory, the one that you've probably heard of, popularly known as like the butterfly effect, right? Which is butterfly flaps its wings on the coast of Africa, and then you've got a hurricane, a few days later, just because of the way that effects multiply, and they do it in a way that is nonlinear, and it's the path it takes influences where it's going. So just know that those are some things that happen in complex systems, not just hurricanes and weather, but also your environments, the ecosystems that you're designing for. Another property is adaptability. Okay, so this is just basically when we say complex adaptive system, that middle word is a way of saying the parts of the system can update their strategies on what they're doing, and the system as a whole then adapts through feedback loops and evolutionary processes. This is a good thing, we like that. There's another property called dynamic equilibrium, which means the system is constantly changing. But even though it's constantly changing, there's still an overall balance. This is why it doesn't tip into like straight up chaos. And it's a form of flexible stability. And then there's also this outlier behavior. If you've heard of something like a black swan event, if you're familiar with that term, basically rare but really extreme events actually will happen more frequently in complex systems than would normally be predicted by your typical bell curve. So this is things like market crashes or disease pandemics. And these traits are the kind of thing that make prediction-based strategies and analytical analysis by parts kind of thinking really ineffective. And I'm being generous by saying less effective, like they're kind of useless in complex systems. But these are also the traits that make a complex system more resilient. what's like a great complex system, a forest, a natural ecosystem. And when some kind of catastrophic event occurs, these are the same properties that make it easy for that complex system to regenerate itself, as long as somebody else hasn't come in and tried to reduce those properties. We don't like that it's dynamic. Can we hold it in place? Fine, but now it's no longer resilient, right? Two more properties that are important. Emergence, you hear this word a lot. Again, it's a popular word because it's got a beautiful meaning and it's got a kind of poetic feel to it, but it is also a scientific term. And emergence basically means when you have simple interactions between things that can lead to unexpected patterns, basically when the whole behaves differently than the sum of the parts would tell you. Which is why, again, we can't just say, well, let me break up this organization and have you do this, you do this, you do this, or let me study this part of the experience here and that part of the experience there. Let's make our service blueprint with this silo, this silo, this silo, put them in rows, put a time axis on it, it's fine, it'll all add up to what we want. It doesn't work that way in a complex system. And self-organization, this is where I warned about cliches. But ultimately, this is where you get those pictures of schools of fish, murmurations, flocks of starlings, birds, etc. Basically, it's when the parts of a system naturally come together and they form ordered patterns without someone telling them what to do. There's no leader, there's no external force that's directing them, there's no central command or control. And yet, you get self-organization, and I'll explain a little bit about how that happens later. But ultimately, those are the properties that make complexity science really, really relevant for anyone who is working in complex service environments, product ecosystems, decentralized organizations, or really rich information environments, which is like all of us, right? Right. Okay, so in other words, here's your headline. You're too long, didn't read. We can't predict or control, or really even design complex systems. When we try to do that, when we try to control them or even try to design them, even if we do something, put an intervention in place, launch it, whatever, the next day things change, right? And not only is it ineffective, but it actually closes us off to potential better things that we could see if we were open to and able to sense and respond instead of trying to control. We also risk a lot of unintended consequences. Few talks have already mentioned unintended consequences, maybe the theme of this conference, I don't know, and endanger the resilience of the system. So that's kind of like a bummer. But the good news is we can work with a system. We just have to work not directly trying to change it, but we work with the affordances and the constraints. Constraints are a big part of complex systems. And when I say constraints, people think constraints as things that fence you in and govern and control. They're actually constraints that enable things. And I think designers understand this better than the lay population, because we talk about like enabling constraints of like a design challenge or a design problem, and having some boundaries actually enables things. There's a lot of beautiful kind of parallels with that in the wider world of complexity science that if any of you want to dig into more, I think you'll really appreciate. But the point is we can actually co-create and adaptively manage the conditions. We're like wiggling little things in the system, see what that does to the bigger thing, sense it as quickly as we can, and then act from there. In a nutshell, it's kind of like you can't actually control the system, but you can wiggle a thing over here, watch to see what happens. Is it a good thing? Figure out how to amplify it and do it more. Is it a bad thing? Figure out how to dampen it and go back. You can't reverse it, but you can dampen the effect and then try something else. And that's kind of like how the whole point of complexity-informed practice works. So I want to say a few things, though, because already you're like, okay, this is sounding like it could make sense. One quick caveat before I get into like how you can actually start to do this in your work. When people hear the phrase change the affordances of the system, they immediately go to systems thinking. And I come into this world from systems thinking, so this is no shade at systems thinking as like an overall mindset. But one of the things that happens with systems thinking is that we tend to think a lot about holistic views. How many times, even in this conference, have we seen a lot of talks that mention systems mapping, holistic views? Very powerful, very good for gaining perspective, maybe sometimes opening your eyes, interrogating something about assumptions. All for it. I do it in my practice all the time. Big, holistic views are great. But what happens is if you stay at that 10,000-foot level, you start to develop some assumptions or some false confidence. You start to feel like you are kind of, in this godlike position. I can see the system. Okay. Or that you can somehow predict. If we just could map the whole system, that we could somehow then predict and maybe avoid some of those unintended consequences. Yeah, good luck. You're telling me you can predict second, third, and fourth order effects? Like you'll be a millionaire if that's the case. Forget it. So basically, as two quick examples. Everybody loves a causal loop diagram in the systems world. I love them too, but I really want to kind of just warn folks. When we really get into systems dynamics and we really get into the causal loop and these kind of relationships, This tends to lead to people who go, oh, okay, I've got it all sorted. And all I need to do is just, find a leverage point and change that thing. Okay. These are maps of the current state. They show you nothing about how this system might be in the process of changing. They tell you nothing about the dispositional state of the system. Unless you could make this and then make it every day or every second or every month, and you could maybe do that. There are versions of that. This is not going to help you know what to do in your practice. These are great for gaining perspective and sometimes blowing people's minds that you have to work with, like certain stakeholders that might not naturally think this way. But this is not going to tell you what to actually do as design interventions go. So be careful about this way of thinking, because especially when you get to that mode where you're like, I have it, I see the system, I'm going to change this thing, I found this leverage point, usually there's still going to be unintended consequences. Part of complexity-informed practice is acknowledging and accepting there will always be unintended consequences, always, right? There's that everybody's favorite quote from, I think, Peter Senge, right? Yesterday's solutions became today's problems. So while we would love to mitigate them, while we can do a better job avoiding some of them for sure, don't ever assume you can avoid them. Part of the importance of complexity-informed work is knowing we can't avoid unintended consequences. So what kind of things can we put in place to see when they're happening sooner? How do we read those weak signals among the noise to take action sooner when we see them starting to happen before they become too big to deal with? And so unintended consequences is one thing to worry about and be careful about. The other is, I like this little cartoon because that guy's in the system. That's the other challenge. People start to get in this mode, like, how many of you have described what you like doing as systems design? Bullshit. You don't design systems. You are part of them. You're not in traffic. You are traffic. We are part of the system that we are designing for. And if you're not actively feeling like you're included in the system you're designing for, what are you doing? Who are you designing for? Why aren't they involved? Right? You need to feel like you are a part of the system in which you're trying to wiggle and make change. So I, caution you not to get stuck in that way of thinking, right? And leverage points. How many of you have read Donella Meadows? Her leverage points. It's a beautiful article. But you should read it. I love Donella Meadows. I've got a quote by her at the end, of course. But leverage points are really sexy because they make us think we can find one magic bullet and we can just turn that thing and be good. That's not how they work. That's not how systems work. And really, instead of looking for those things that, we just turn this knob and we can avoid everything or fix everything, really we look at parts of a system to find out where we can get into dialogue with the system. They're kind of like moments or beacons that allow us to learn from the system and talk to it and hear what is happening. And then we can respond in kind, all right? Levers, by the way, leverage points and levers belong to machines, okay? Does the service ecosystem that you guys are designing for actually look like this? Is this like what humans and the dynamics you're designing around look like? No, it's more like this. Here's your cliche, right? The murmuration of starlings. I like this because these are the type of complex systems that are like the organizations and the service ecosystems you're working with. This is much closer to where you're at. And these kind of murmurations that make these beautiful shapes, I think it's notable that there is no central command, as I mentioned. This is a good example of self-organization. There's no leader bird in any of these flocks. There's no external force. They're not responding to wind. They are literally just self-organizing, and they actually are doing this by following 3 simple rules. Each bird is effectively doing 3 things. 1, move to the center. So at all times, the bird's trying to move to the center of the group. 2, follow your neighbor. So at all times, the bird is trying to maintain a certain amount of closeness to its neighbors. 3, don't collide, trying not to collide with each other. The combination of those 3 rules produce this beautiful thing. And so I heard beautiful rules, and I go, oh, designers love high-level beautiful rules. We call those principles, right? So I'm going to, oops, did we lose some? Oh, there was a beautiful background image on this slide of a murmuration. Pretend it's there. But ultimately, these are some of those principles that I wanted to share with you, okay? And you don't have to take a bunch of pictures. I'll share this all later. But I want to caution some things. This is where you're going to go, okay, these are great principles, Jen, but still, where's the case study? I'm not giving you any case studies or toolkits or templates today because complexity teaches us that anything that I give you as an example won't be relevant to what you're doing. So I'm trying to live that principle by saying, yeah, no, I'm not giving you examples. Your job is to read these, take them home, think about in your daily practice, what might these look like? They're open-ended on purpose, but these are all informed by complexity science. So 1, design less, enable more, right? Lighter, faster, facilitation, thank you, Andy, contextual, right? Contextually aware and distributed. Reduce the distance between information and people. Trust them with it. Avoid premature convergence. We're pretty good at this as designers, but we got to help other people who aren't good with this, especially those who are afraid, like the example from Andy's talk. Hold space for divergence, for noticing, for highlighting weak signals among the noise, especially anomalies, because when people see anomalies and unexpected things, it actually wakes them up to complexity, which is really powerful. Aim for coherence and not total alignment. Conflict is fine. There was a talk yesterday that even mentioned this, and I thought it was really beautiful. We don't have to eliminate all conflict. We just have to get people to a point where they can agree enough to move forward. Can you live with this? Satisficing, right? Approach things obliquely or indirectly. This is something that's really important, especially because we can't directly drive change. We can actually get at it kind of from the side. And try to engage in more risky play and get the others around you to do it. Don't get stuck in one metaphor, process, or pattern. And I want to say a couple fast things about process. Guys, we got to get out of this service blueprint rut. I love a beautiful, good service blueprint. I make them still in my practice all the time. But for complexity, they're not that useful. And I would like to encourage you to maybe consider this your provocation or permission to go hunting for other ways of mapping. There have been some good examples at this conference. Big ecosystem maps, systems mapping in general is really powerful. But also just let your fingers do the walking. Wordly maps, Zenko maps, I'm pointing at the monitor like you guys can see it. Estruan maps, something called warm data, Nora Bateson's word for information that happens between the things you can actually see and feel and measure, relationships, influence. Liberatory structures and the way that we can engage with each other that isn't something you map on time. Like get out of the time axis, just get away from it a little bit. Try to get away from linear mapping because even if your brain is comfortable with nonlinear thinking, we still end up forcing it into those forms in our maps. So, the map is not the territory, but these aren't even really maps. They're more like vessels to get you from here to there. They're meant to be a way of going from here to a shared meaning or meaning making or communicating an idea from me to someone else. Once you've crossed that metaphorical river, get out of the boat and move forward, right? Don't make that framework or that map or that way of working an identity. Now, if your organization forces you to do it, don't listen. Don't ask for permission. Try to find small ways to get out of those metaphors. And while we're at metaphors, we really got to talk about some of the other prevailing metaphors. We talk a lot about orchestration in our field. Love it, I get it, but not all systems can be orchestrated. When you're working in a complex system, you're probably not orchestrating anything. It's much more like jazz. It's more improvised. And it's not free for all. Jazz is not free for all. I guess some is, but most jazz is not free for all. People have mastered their craft. They've mastered their instruments. They've studied theory. What they're doing is reading body language, and they're working with other people where they've gotten good at sensing and responding. Another metaphor, theater, front stage, backstage, visibility, blah, 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 blah. Again, helpful in certain scenarios. In complexity, we're not scripting. We're not choreographing. It's more like street theater. What does that mean in your position? What in your daily practice could you make more like street theater? Right? So I couldn't do a systems talk without actually having a quote from Danelle Meadows, but I like this one because it's actually not about systems, it's about paradigms and exactly what I've just been talking about. People who cling to paradigms, which means just about all of us, take one look at the spacious possibility that everything they think is guaranteed to be nonsense, which is kind of what complexity science is basically teaching us, like everything we think is actually not quite right. And most people pedal rapidly in the opposite direction. But in fact, everyone who has managed to entertain that idea for a moment or a lifetime has found it to be the basis for radical empowerment. And it's in this space of mastery over paradigms, not mastering paradigms, mastery over the idea of paradigms, not holding on to any one of them too tightly. And when I say paradigms, anything, right? It's in that place where people throw off addictions, live in constant joy, bring down empires, get locked up or burned at the stake or crucified or shot, and have impacts that last for millennia. And that's the kind of impact that I think this conference should be all about. So to wrap this up, when this happens, these are really important moments. When these happen, the next time you find yourself in this situation with a colleague, with a client, remember that these are the moments that wake people up to what complexity is and what it is not, and that we are living in complex systems, even though we like to pretend that some of them are merely complicated and ordered. And our impact beyond blueprints and in the places we can't orchestrate is actually where service design is needed most. So this quote is where I actually really want to end. This is from a politician from the States. He always said all politics is local. I think all design is local, and really when we say the word design, we mean all change is local, all right? So if you're like, I still can't imagine doing any of this, Jen, here's how you do it. You go home on Monday and you ask yourself, what do I care about deep in my heart? Who else cares about this? Find them, however you need to, in your organization or outside of it. Ask what you can change. What can you get away with? Not what you can get permission for. Then how do you look for the impact of whatever you do? And if it's good, how do you amplify it? Okay. That's it. And thank you. Now you can take the photos. We'll skip questions so we can keep things roughly on track, but definitely have a look at that because I did my best to pull together some links and resources for